Hello, today I'm going to be doing the reread book tag because I've seen everybody do it at this point and I've loved watching everybody's responses. I'll of course link Roz and Alf down below the original creators tag so you can see their version. I'm always fascinated by the books that people reread a lot and why they reread them because I think you can tell a lot about a person by looking at the books that they return to. The first question is, let's assume you do reread if you're doing this tag, so where do you sit on the rereading scale from almost never to all the time? For me, the answer to this question really depends on the year. Some years I reread a lot of books, some years I never reread. I do tend to reread 1 or 2 books a year, so for me I feel like my position has to be straight down the middle, which is probably like the only time I'm ever vaguely neutral in life. Has that changed over your reading life? Yes, definitely. Anybody who's been a literature student knows that you have to reread an awful lot, especially when it comes to dissertations and essays. So for those 4 years, and I guess when I was like doing my A-levels, I was constantly rereading. And then when I stopped having to read stuff, I stopped reading in general, I just didn't reread much because I didn't necessarily need to. I'm now getting back into rereading, one because I'm getting old. I'm growing up, and it's now been like a decade since I've read some of my favourite books, you know, that I read when I was a teenager, and that makes me slightly uncomfortable, so I want to revisit some of those books. And I'm also, I guess, getting a bit more into making videos again, so I want to reread books in order to actually talk about them in an eloquent manner, which my brain is like a sieve, so if I don't reread a book before I make a video, like Middlemarch for instance, every time I made a video I actually reread that whole part of the book before the video because I just think I'd forget everything. I tend to do that a little bit more and make notes and annotate it in a way that is a bit like studying. When do you reread? Maybe immediately after finishing the book, or not till years later, or when the mood strikes. I think I'm definitely a mood reader, so I often reread a book when it's kind of brought up in conversation again, like if it's a new adaptation. So recently when there was Rebecca, I was desperate to reread Rebecca. And as I said before, it is now years later because I want to remember the books that were my favourites back then and just make sure that they're still my favourites now. I feel like number 4 is the big question. Why do you reread books? My answer to this question of course depends on why I'm reading the book in the first place, if it's for an academic reason or if it's I'm rereading like Middlemarch for a video for instance, but majority of the time it's often because I miss it. Me and Wuthering Heights have a beautiful rereading relationship. I tend to reread Wuthering Heights every year. I don't know why I picked Wuthering Heights, maybe it's because it's one of the smaller Brontë novels and I look forward to it. And when I haven't reread Wuthering Heights recently, I kind of yearn for the story and the darkness of it. And I kind of want to revisit that world almost. Ultimately, I reread books because I love them and I want to revisit them. They're like an old friend that I just pop in and say hello to every now and again. Rereading also charts, I think, my growing up in so many ways. Wuthering Heights is a great example because when I first read Wuthering Heights, you know, I read it as a romance. I read it I think when I was about 12 and I read it wrong. Like I think I read it incorrectly and then I revisited and realised how dark and murderous it was and how awful these people were. And each time I've read it, something new has come to me and I've loved it in a different way and for a different reason. And so I think I often reread to almost chart my growth as a person alongside this novel, which is a really kind of beautiful relationship. An important thing to know about me is that I'm very obsessive and I have a very weird thing about maintaining connections. So if I really love something, I have to constantly renew that connection because I'm so scared someone's gonna like take it away from me. Like it won't be valid that I love, you know, Jane Austen unless I constantly reread her, as if someone's gonna come away and take my Jane Austen badge. How do you reread? Faster, slower, or just the best bits? If I'm reading for like an academic purpose, I'll often read quite slowly because I'll be annotating and I'll also be looking at other sources. If I'm reading for pleasure, I think I just read. I'm a slow reader, so I read slowly all of the time, but I guess I might read a little bit faster then. I do often, I don't necessarily think this is rereading. I sometimes go back to the best bits, like Mrs Dalloway walking around London. I realise that's like pretty much all of Mrs Dalloway, but the scene of her like walking up the stairs and some beautiful imagery I'd often want to return to because I love to collect quotations in my mind. Sometimes I just want to check that I've got the quotation right, or just go back to that world for a little bit and I'll know where those pieces are in the novel. Like the end of Wuthering Heights, for example, is one of the most beautiful, I think, endings in literature ever. So I often return to that. But that's not necessarily about rereading, that's just getting a bit of a refresher, I guess. I think answering these questions makes me realise I have a bit of a commitment problem, but not in the way that I don't want to commit, in the way that I'm like so eager to commit. Who or what do you reread? Authors, genres, or individual books? I'm pretty certain the 2 books I've reread the most in my life are the 2 books I've already mentioned, and they are Wuthering Heights and Mrs Dalloway. This is my older copy of Mrs Dalloway, and it is completely it's kind of sad because all these pencil annotations I made at university are really faded now, but I've had to sellotape this book back together so many times. I should say that I did actually read this at university, and did I do an essay on this? I did my dissertation. Wow, I'm getting old. I did my dissertation on Mrs Dalloway and also studied at university, so I definitely reread it a lot for that reason. I think this answers another question a bit later on, but the first time I read Mrs Dalloway, I didn't like it. I couldn't connect with it, I found it really cold, but there were some images that just stood out to me and I kept thinking about it and I couldn't let go. So then I decided to reread it, I think maybe a year later, or like 6 months, a year. I felt so drawn to this novel that I had to reread it. And then upon the second rereading, I just fell in love and knew it would be one of my all-time favourite novels. And I think I've reread this book definitely over 20. I think over 20 times. And my most recent, I think, was last year, and I still absolutely loved it. I do think I'm not going to reread it again anytime soon because I really feel like I know this novel off by heart now, but I'll have to keep checking in with it because it's one of those books that is so influential to me, really changed everything, that if I didn't, I'd be worried that I would stop liking it when I got older. So I'm going to have to maybe read it every 2 years or so just to make sure that we're still friends. The next book, as I already mentioned, is Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. I love this dark, horrendous book. It's one of my all-time favourites. I only really tend to reread my favourite novels because I wouldn't want to, it'd be really boring to just reread like a mundane book. I read the novel when I was really young and I've constantly revisited it. I really want to reread Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is one of my favourite novels, but I read it when I was 12 and I haven't revisited it since. Like, I cannot remember that novel. Of course I know the plot of Jane Eyre, but I don't really know the novel in the way that I know Wuthering Heights. And now I get nervous, like, maybe I don't like Jane Eyre now. Maybe I'll read it and just not like it. I'm really nervous to reread Jane Eyre, but I think I'm going to have to do soon because I don't feel like I can count it as one of my favourite novels, even though it is, just because it has been, I'm no good at maths, but it's been over a decade since I've read it. Is there a book you found better when you reread it? 100%, and it is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Me and Jane Austen actually didn't have the best start to our relationship. We had a troublesome start. Northanger Abbey was the first Jane Austen novel, and actually the first classic I ever read. It's like a really monumental book for me, but I didn't like it, which is kind of the worst feeling. At the same time, I actually did read all of the other Jane Austen novels, so I think I was also comparing them because I was so in love with like Pride and Prejudice. But what I found is I just couldn't get away from this novel. Northanger Abbey just followed me around everywhere. When I went to do my BA at York St John, it was one of the first novels, I think it was the novel, that I ever read and studied at university. I then got more interested in it and kind of felt that it had, more worth than I was giving it. Then a few years later, when I went to do my 18th century MA at York, we read Northanger Abbey, I think around the topic of sensibility, yes, and we also read Anne Radcliffe as well, which obviously makes sense because it's Jane Austen. And it wasn't really until then, and after all the studying that I did for it, I fell in love with this novel. So this is definitely, it's followed me we've come full circle, me and Jane Austen, and I really love Northanger Abbey now. It's not my favourite novel, but I think I love it now. I think originally, kind of my BA, I was like, I like it, but now I think I'm at the stage of love. Yeah, I think I love it now. And like Northanger Abbey, obviously, as I just said, me and Mrs Dalloway had a very similar start to life, which I think reminds me that sometimes I just need to reread books if I'm not 100% certain about them. If I feel a bit meh about them, I think I should probably reread, because by the sounds of things, I have a big tendency to love books more after rereading them. Linked to that, the next question is, which books have we reread that were worse upon rereading them? I think, to be honest, any of the books I didn't like at university that I just reread for essays, I probably still didn't like them. But I don't think I've reread a book that I previously liked and then stopped liking. And I'm also scared of that. As I said, Jane Eyre would be devastated if I didn't like it. Yeah, I'm just scared of which of my favourite novels will become more terrible as the years go on. I'm aware that this video is very repetitive because it's literally Mrs Dalloway, Wuthering Heights, and then like one mention for Northanger Abbey. But the last question is, which book have you reread the most? And as I already said, it would have to be Mrs Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, because I've definitely read this like 20 times. I do tend to reread a lot of Virginia Woolf, mainly because I did do my dissertation on her, so I think I've read To the Lighthouse maybe about 8, and I think that's my second favourite Woolf novel. I love To the Lighthouse. But yes, Mrs Dalloway. One thing I'm realising is that all the books I tend to reread are classics, which probably says a lot about me as a person and what I read and what I think is important, which is slightly troubling. But yeah, because I reread the Austen novels, all of them, about maybe 4 times, maybe Pride and Prejudice a bit more, and I guess the ones I studied, like Mansfield Park, probably more as well, and Wuthering Heights. And I've reread Virginia Woolf's works a lot, but I have never reread a contemporary novel. I also have a problem that I tend to like really big contemporary novels, like The Luminaries by Ellen Nakata. I'd love to reread one day, but that's like 1,000 pages. And so is Jonathan Strange and Mr Noir, which is also one of my favourite novels. I'm not quite sure why I'm not afraid of big, chunky contemporary novels, but I am really scared of big classics. Actually, no, I'm not. But yeah, a bit more of a dedication, I feel. Interesting. Anyway, that's a different tangent. This video is over, so I'm going to say thank you for watching. Please let me know which book you reread the most, or if you never reread, actually that's even more interesting to me. One thing I would be interested in knowing for my personal, this is an extra question, I'm adding a question on to this tag. Are the books that you reread your favourite books? Is there a connection between the ones that you choose to reread a lot and the ones you consider your favourite novels? Because for me, there is a definite link, so it'd be interesting if any of you had that kind of same relationship with your books. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this video up, so thank you so much for watching, supporting my channel, all of those things, and I'll see you again soon with another bookish video.